Beneath the tracks of America's greatest transportation achievement lies a burial ground that nobody wants to talk about. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in May 10, 1869, is celebrated as a triumph of human engineering and American ambition. But here's what most people don't know. Somewhere between 1,000 and 20,000 workers died building this railroad. Their names were never recorded. Their families were never compensated. And in many cases, their bodies were buried where they fell, directly underneath the railroad tracks themselves. Most of these workers were Chinese laborers and Irish immigrants. They faced wages half those of white workers. They endured conditions so brutal that disease swept through work camps like invisible executioners. The official narrative says approximately 1,200 workers died, but contemporary accounts and historical research suggest the real number was far higher. Some estimates place it as high as 20,000. The military precision of the railroad construction masked a humanitarian catastrophe, and America has spent the last 150 years trying to forget it. This is the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, a monument built on forgotten graves. To understand how so many workers died building the Transcontinental Railroad, we first need to understand why it was being built at all. In the 1860s, America was being torn apart by the Civil War. Political leaders and businessmen saw a unified transportation network as a solution to national fragmentation. If a railroad connected the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean, they believed, America would be stronger, more unified, more prosperous. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law. This legislation authorized two railroad companies to begin construction. The Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific Railroad would build eastward from Sacramento, California. They would meet somewhere in the middle. The company that laid the most track would receive the most government subsidies and land grants. It was a race, and races have winners and losers. The Union Pacific began hiring workers in 1863. These were primarily Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and freed African Americans. They worked on the Great Plains, pushing westward across relatively flat terrain. The Central Pacific faced a much greater challenge. They had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains. The granite peaks rose 13,000 feet into the air. There was no reasonable way to go around them. The railroad would have to go through them. This meant drilling tunnels through solid rock. Dozens of tunnels. The most famous, the Summit Tunnel at Donner Pass, required drilling through nearly 1,700 feet of solid granite. The Central Pacific Railroad solved their labor shortage the way many American companies did in the 1860s. They imported Chinese laborers. Advertisements in Chinese newspapers promised good wages and steady work. Thousands of Chinese laborers responded. Between 10,000 and 12,000 Chinese workers eventually worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. They were paid approximately $1 per day. White workers were paid $3 per day for identical work in identical conditions. The company provided minimal shelter, no medical care, minimal food, and absolutely no protection from the extreme elements or dangerous working conditions. Construction of the Transcontinental Railroad began with relatively straightforward work. Crews graded road beds, They laid rails on relatively flat ground. But as they pushed deeper into wilderness and higher into mountains, the work became exponentially more dangerous. On the Union Pacific side, workers faced the vast emptiness of the American West. The Great Plains offered little protection from winter blizzards. Temperatures could plummet to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Snowstorms appeared with little warning. Frostbite and hypothermia killed workers. So did disease. In 1864, a massive cholera outbreak swept through Union Pacific construction camps near the Missouri River. Hundreds of workers died. Many were never identified. They were buried in unmarked graves near the tracks. The company tried to cover up the epidemic to prevent workers from fleeing their posts. If word spread that cholera was killing workers in the camps, recruitment would become nearly impossible. On the Central Pacific side, the Sierra Nevada mountains presented different but equally deadly challenges. The tunnels through the mountains required blasting through solid granite. Workers descended on ropes and bosun's chairs into canyons barely accessible by foot. They would drill holes into the rock face, pack those holes with the newly invented nitroglycerin explosive, light a fuse, and pray. Nitroglycerin was unstable, unpredictable. Vibrations from previous explosions could trigger secondary detonations. A worker might light a fuse and then inadvertently trigger an explosion 50 feet away from where they expected it. Rock slides were common. Workers were buried under tons of granite rubble. Many were never recovered. Their bodies simply remained entombed in the mountain. The engineering achievement was staggering. In 15 months, Chinese workers drilled through the summit tunnel. 15 months of constant blasting and grinding. In winter, they had to clear snow from the tunnel entrances daily. Avalanches were constant threats. In one particularly severe winter, an avalanche swept away an entire work camp. 30 men disappeared under the snow. Some were never found. The railroad company didn't stop to search for them. Construction continued. Here's what makes the death toll so mysterious. The official railroad company records claim only about 200 deaths during the entire Central Pacific construction. But contemporary newspaper accounts tell a very different story. In 1865, a San Francisco newspaper reported that Chinese workers were dying at rates approaching 10% of the workforce annually. If that estimate is accurate, and if 10,000 Chinese workers were employed over the construction period, that would mean 1,000 deaths per year. 5 years of construction would mean 5,000 deaths. Just from disease and workplace accidents, the total would be far higher. Even more troubling is what happened to the bodies. Chinese workers who died were often buried near the tracks. Some families paid substantial money to have remains exhumed and shipped back to China. These remains were placed in wooden boxes and transported by ship across the Pacific. But not all remains were recovered. Many workers had no family in America, no money for repatriation. They were buried in unmarked
graves. Decades later, when railroad companies began modernizing and replacing the original tracks, workers sometimes uncovered human remains buried beneath the railbed. Skeletons, bones, sometimes entire graves with multiple bodies stacked together. The railroad company records became increasingly selective about which deaths they recorded. A worker who died in an accident at a main construction site would be documented, but a worker who died at a remote camp miles away from company headquarters might not be recorded at all. Work crew leaders had financial incentives to under-report deaths. If death tolls seemed too high, the company might reduce the wage rates or bring in replacement workers from a different region. So deaths were quietly buried. Workers were listed as simply having departed the job. No death record, no body, no compensation for families. In 1866, approximately 4,000 Chinese workers went on strike. Their demands were straightforward. They wanted 10-hour workdays instead of 11-hour workdays. They wanted higher wages. They wanted acknowledgement of their humanity. The strike lasted a week before the railroad company simply cut off all food and supplies to the workers' camps. Faced with starvation, the workers capitulated. The strike was broken. But here's what most people don't know. Approximately 200 workers didn't return to work after the strike. They simply vanished. No records of them leaving the job. No documentation of their deaths. They simply disappeared from company payroll records. Did they flee? Did they die and get buried secretly? Did the company murder them to suppress the strike? The historical record is silent.
By 1869, the two railroad lines were approaching each other. The Union Pacific had laid over 2,000 miles of track. The Central Pacific had laid over 1,000 miles. The race to complete the final connection was intensifying. Speed was everything. Safety was neglected. In May 1869, the two railroad lines met at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. The ceremonial Golden Spike was driven into the ground on May 10, 1869. Photographs show railroad executives and government officials celebrating the achievement. But conspicuously absent from these photographs are the workers who built the railroad, especially the Chinese workers. In one photograph, the Central Pacific crew is shown, but the Chinese workers have been cropped out or removed. The narrative of the railroad's completion was carefully edited to erase the contributions of immigrant workers. Within weeks, many of those workers were dismissed from their jobs. The Central Pacific no longer needed them. They were sent away. Some returned to China. Some tried to find work elsewhere in California. Many died in subsequent years from injuries and illnesses acquired during construction. Their deaths were never connected to the railroad project. The Transcontinental Railroad transformed America. It connected the coasts. It enabled commerce. It accelerated westward settlement. It also accelerated the extraction of resources from the West, which led to environmental devastation and the displacement and destruction of Native American tribes whose lands the railroad crossed. The railroad itself was a physical monument to American achievement, but it was also a mass grave. The railroad routes, particularly through the Sierra Nevada and across the Great Plains, literally pass over thousands of unmarked burial sites. In 1869, nobody cared about accurate record-keeping for immigrant workers. In 1969, 100 years later, America was still not confronting this history. In 2019, more than 150 years after the railroad's completion, serious historical investigations finally began into the true death toll and the burial sites of workers. Chinese-American organizations have led efforts to document the names and fates of Chinese railroad workers. Some have been identified, many have not. The National Park Service and various historical societies have begun excavations in areas where workers are believed to have been buried. Skeletal remains have been found, but in many cases, they remain unidentified. The remains are buried again, this time with some acknowledgement and respect, but the families never get closure. The workers are never fully named. The sacrifice remains partially forgotten.
The Transcontinental Railroad stands as one of America's greatest achievements. It's also one of America's greatest hidden tragedies. Somewhere between 1,000 and 20,000 workers died building this railroad. We don't know the exact number. We don't know most of their names. We don't know where all their bodies are buried. The official records minimize the death toll. The company histories erase the contributions of immigrant workers. And the American public has never been forced to confront the human cost of this engineering marvel. What happened to the missing workers? Where are the bodies of the thousands who died? Why were records deliberately destroyed or falsified? These questions remain largely unanswered. The railroad continues operating today. Millions of people ride trains over the graves of workers whose deaths were never recorded. The Transcontinental Railroad is a monument to human achievement, built literally on a foundation of forgotten graves. If you want to uncover more stories of American infrastructure that hide dark histories, subscribe to Hidden America. Next time, we'll explore the construction of the New York City subway system and discover the workers who died beneath the streets of Manhattan. We'll investigate the cover-ups, we'll examine the corruption, and we'll ask why some workers' names were completely erased from historical records. Subscribe now for more hidden infrastructure stories. And remember, every great achievement in America's history has a shadow. Sometimes that shadow is made of thousands of forgotten graves.